Okay, thank you very much. It's perfect. Appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be with you. As David said, it is an honor also for me to be here. I'm very impressed by Columbia and all of the attention to these critical issues that you're demonstrating in this conference. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Pennsylvania shale gas experience and do a little bit of a case study. And let me just start by saying part of my Pennsylvania shale gas experience was doing an interview with Josh Fox, who made Gasland. I had a policy when I was Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, which was the regulatory agency in charge of both permitting gas wells as well as writing and then enforcing the rules for operation of the industry to speak with anybody who asked for an interview. And I didn't know Josh Fox prior to that interview, but I was glad to talk with him. I gave him a 60-minute interview, and those of you who have seen Gasland probably know that I'm in it. It's about probably 90 seconds, and as my mother said, she loves the beautiful pictures of my face in Gasland. Mothers always can find the best in every circumstance, and my mother is very good at that. I'd be glad in the question and answer period to talk a little bit more about Gasland if you would like. So this is my own view of what the strategic objective around any shale gas resource ought to be. And simply put, it's to produce the gas and protect the environment. That was our strategic objective in Pennsylvania. And let me say, we've been producing gas in Pennsylvania well before the shale gas revolution. It goes back literally more than 100 years of gas production in Pennsylvania, and even longer in terms of oil production. So oil and gas production in Pennsylvania was not new, but shale gas production was. Our first exploratory shale gas wells were drilled in 2005. And by 2007, the very first commercial development of shale gas wells was underway. Now, we had an existing oil and gas program. We had regulators. We had rules. But it's true that those rules were written before shale gas development. So when we talk about producing the gas and protecting the environment, we were focusing on producing shale gas and also making changes to our rules and regulation and our system of enforcement to protect the environment, knowing that shale gas development, at least in Pennsylvania, was quite different from what had been going on for a long time. Now, there is a little bit of tension between producing the gas and protecting the environment. I'm not going to say they are completely, totally consistent objectives, but I am going to tell you that they are largely consistent. And in one very important way, the production of gas actually protects the environment, and we will talk some more about that in a bit. So this is a little more history on Pennsylvania. You can see we've had a lot of oil and gas wells drilled in Pennsylvania over our entire history. 400,000, and truthfully, nobody really knows how many. That isn't a relatively educated estimate. But in truth, there is some uncertainty about over about 150 years of development, how many oil and gas wells were drilled, because most of those oil and gas wells were drilled well before there was any permitting or any regulatory requirements. As you can see, we now produce a lot of gas in Pennsylvania. So producing the gas part of our strategic objective is being achieved in Pennsylvania. 2 trillion cubic feet, roughly speaking. That's a little less than 10% of U.S. gas production. And the Marcellus includes more than just Pennsylvania, it should be clear. includes West Virginia, includes Ohio. It could include New York, and I'll talk a little bit more about New York as we go along. When I talk to particularly universities and students at universities about shale gas, I actually insist on being able to talk about our energy choices broadly first. I think it's very important normally to put the discussion about shale gas development in the context of our other energy choices. It includes nuclear, it includes oil, it includes coal, it includes renewable energy. And I can create a list of what I call the uglies, the impacts for any kind of energy development, whether we're talking about shale gas, and I'm going to go through some of the uglies here that we regulated for, or whether we were talking about nuclear or renewables, wind, for example, or coal. I live in a community that is within an area called 3 Mile Island. How many of you have heard of 3 Mile Island? Quite a lot. 3 Mile Island is a nuclear station, and there was a very serious nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island in 1979, I believe. I've got the date right. So the point is they all have impacts. So in Pennsylvania, these are the list of impacts that we regulated for. And David did a lot of good work here. So in the interest of time, I'm going to probably go through this relatively quickly so that we can get to some of the other issues. The water issues was the focus of David's remarks. And that, I think, has been the major concern of the public in Pennsylvania. What would be the impacts on water from shale gas development? And really, there have been two categories of concern. One is, where does the water come from, and will you damage streams when you withdraw water? And the second is, where does the produced water or the flowback water go once gas production has happened? Can you handle the polluted water that comes back up safely without damaging the environment? The second set of issues is operational problems and accidents. You can have very good regulations, you can have good enforcement of those regulations, but at the end of the day, it's the companies that are driving the trucks, drilling the gas wells, and handling pits and impoundments. You can have good practices in place, but if an employee or a contractor doesn't follow those practices, perhaps even the safety requirements are not enough. I'll give you one example. Leaks from pits. As you saw in David's presentation, the rules are, especially when dealing with flowback and produced water, to have very specific and relatively tough requirements about lining of a pit. That's in order to protect, obviously, the groundwater and the soil from potential leaks from that pit. Now, when that pit is properly constructed and when it's properly operated, it is, in fact, safe. But if you have a contractor who, for example, is bringing flowback water to that pit and then throws into the pit a big hose with a metal piece at the end to discharge drilling wastewater into the pit, you can rip the liner. So it's very, very important that you work with operators to not only make sure that the equipment is what is required in regulation, but the actual operation of the equipment is sound. Now, good enforcement goes some distance to making sure that happens. But I'm a strong believer in creating a culture of safety within companies. And I think it's important to help companies maintain that culture of safety. The very best companies have a culture of safety. But the very best companies know that it's a day-by-day challenge to maintain a culture of safety. And some companies, frankly, need to acquire a culture of safety. They may not, in fact, be at that level of excellence that we want all companies to be at. So operational problems have a lot to do with this culture of safety. Truck traffic, at least in the US, one of the major public concerns is just the large volumes of trucks on the roads. This is true in Texas. It's true certainly in the Marcellus region and Pennsylvania. There are a lot of big trucks that show up in these communities where previously there might not have been any or very little truck traffic. So concerns about damage done to roads, congestion, the safety of the trucks themselves. These are issues that are important to identify, I think, going in ahead of time. One of the things I did in Pennsylvania was have an agreement with our state police. The state police in Pennsylvania have authority to pull over trucks and inspect them. And the agreement that my department and the state police had was that the state police would target drilling trucks for added inspections. And that was a way of trying to make sure that the industry knew that the companies they contracted with were going to be inspected, and that if, in fact, they were operating trucks that didn't meet our safety requirements, there was a good chance they were going to be caught. Gas migration is the fourth issue. Now, this is the issue that we talked a little bit about this morning, and David certainly touched on it. But this is the issue that's raised by that picture in Gasland of a tap and then the water coming out of the tap exploding in a fireball. Gas migration is one possible explanation for that picture. Gas migration from a gas well is one possible explanation for that picture. As David pointed out, and as I said in my brief comment this morning, another explanation is that the gas was already in the water before gas drilling occurred. It was what's called biogenic gas, and in fact, the odds are that the cause of a water catching on fire is the biogenic explanation as opposed to the gas drilling explanation. But in Pennsylvania, we have had probably somewhere between, I would say, 50 to 100 private water wells that have had gas migrate from a mistake in gas drilling to that private water well. 50 to 100 private water wells. Now, we have 12 million people in Pennsylvania. Most of the people in Pennsylvania get their drinking water not from a private water well, but from a public water system. And for the 10 million plus people who get their water from a public water system, none of them have had one drop of their water impacted by gas drilling in Pennsylvania, ever. In the history, at least the modern history of Pennsylvania, has that ever happened. Now, we have about 1 million private water wells in Pennsylvania, give or take a little bit. So out of 1 million private water wells in Pennsylvania, we've had roughly 50 to 100 that have experienced contamination with methane, just methane, not frac fluids. That's an important point. We're talking about methane, not frac fluids, contaminating their water because of a mistake in the gas drilling phase. Now, for those 50 to 100 families, that's a very big problem. Gas polluting their private water well could mean their property is not sellable. It may be worthless. Who would buy a home with a private water well that had been contaminated by methane? So I don't mean to say that that's not a problem. It is, and it needs to be addressed by regulators as well as the industry. But I do think it's very important to put it in context. I mean, very frankly, if I had a perfect way of making energy, would I support gas production as I do? No, I would not, because gas production is not perfect. It's all a question of how does gas production compare to other alternatives? And how can the impacts be minimized and the benefits of gas production, which are large, be maximized? So gas migration, number 4 on my list, might be the number 1 issue in terms of water in Pennsylvania associated with shale gas development. In Pennsylvania, we have both private lands where gas production is done with agreements with private landowners and then public lands. This point may be not so relevant to the situation in Colombia, but Pennsylvanians see those two situations as different. They generally support gas production on private lands. And they're okay with gas production on public lands, but they, in fact, would like it more limited on public lands. I think it's fair to say they don't want gas production in our parks, for example, at all. They would ban it in our parks. Though, as a matter of law, it's not banned in Pennsylvania's parks. But if that was put to a vote within Pennsylvania, people of Pennsylvania would probably vote to ban any kind of gas production, certainly shale gas production, in their parks, while at the same time they would support gas production on private lands. Number 6 is a very important point, and that goes to the capacity of a regulatory agency charged with overseeing gas development. I believe that regulatory agencies are critical in this whole process. I think it's vital that a regulatory agency be professional, independent, and have the necessary resources to do their job right. You can't do a regulatory job right unless you have enough staff to do it. You may need some other things too, but I've been a regulator in Pennsylvania in 2 different roles, and I know that adequate staff is vital. So this issue, I think, has to be addressed, and we'll explain to you what we did in Pennsylvania on that issue. Number 7 is air impacts. There are some air impacts associated with at least full-scale gas production. I'm not talking about the exploratory phase. This is really not an issue during exploration. But if you get to full commercial development, where you're putting in place compressor engines and all of the infrastructure necessary not only to drill the gas well, but then to move the gas from the gas well to markets, there are issues that are important to address in the air area. In Pennsylvania, this is actually a really important issue because Pennsylvania has significant pre-existing air issues. In other words, we have some dirty air issues that have nothing to do with gas drilling. It has to do with lots of cars, lots of factories, lots of older coal-fired power plants, some cases without modern pollution controls on them. What that means is any new source of emissions is important because we start with a load in the atmosphere already, or load in the air of various pollutants that do cause human illness. So we care a lot about number 7 in Pennsylvania. We'll talk a little bit about what can be done about that. 8, I really can't add to the tremendous presentations that David, in particular, has provided on the seismic issues. I certainly learned some things listening to David this morning, and I'm sure everybody in this room learned at least a few things from listening to David on the seismicity issues. This is an issue of concern to people. Certainly in Youngstown, when that, I think it was a 4.2 earthquake occurred, it got a lot of attention, and it should have. People in Youngstown felt their homes shake. Nobody is going to put up with homes shaking because of gas production or any other reason. That's an issue that has to be addressed. And it is being addressed. And of course, this issue of induced seismicity did exist well before we had the first shale gas well. It's not a new issue in of itself, but it's certainly an issue associated with shale gas development. The disclosure of chemicals issue is also one that has been talked about at length. I understand why the public is very focused on this issue. People want to know what is in these mixtures, because this mixture is being pumped down through aquifers. People rightly are concerned about protecting their groundwater, and they have concern when they hear the word chemical. I will tell you that at the end of the day, in terms of what happens with the environment, what happens with the quality of water, I actually don't think this is a key issue. I think it's a key issue in public confidence. It's a key issue in terms of ensuring the public that this can be done safely. But in the reality of what's going to happen with the water, this would be well down my list. One thing I would add on this issue of disclosure, you heard that in Pennsylvania and most other states now, disclosure is pretty well required, with one possible exception, and that's when a additive put into the mix is quote-unquote proprietary. In Pennsylvania, at least, and some other states, even when something is proprietary, the companies must disclose that to the regulator. It will not be disclosed to the public. It won't be put up on a website and revealed to competitors, but it must be disclosed to the regulator. And that's the state of the law in Pennsylvania. So if there is an emergency, or if there is a medical question about a particular substance, the company must answer the question about what was included in the mix, including proprietary chemicals or elements. And I personally support that. I think it's very important that all elements, all chemicals are disclosed to the public and the regulator with the protection for trade secrets that can be done consistent with what I've just said. So how did we go about regulating in Pennsylvania? And this is going to be different in different parts of the world, but I'll give you how we did it. In Pennsylvania, our new regulations to address those issues, I just went through 9 issues, had to go through a process. And there was really two processes. One is the executive branch of government. That's where I worked. I worked for the governor of Pennsylvania, and we, as in the executive branch, the governor can issue regulations. Now, it's a more complicated process than that, but for the purpose of this conversation, I think that's enough for you to understand that the governor has the authority to issue regulations. Now, we would do that by first proposing a regulation and putting it out for public comment. And we had a discussion at lunch that kind of touched on how you do this. In Pennsylvania and in most parts of the US, it's very important for the government first to propose a set of rules and then have the public comment on those rules. That's generally how it's done in the US. The executive branch also has the responsibility of enforcing those rules. The agency that I led had the responsibility of enforcing those rules. And I will, in a minute, walk you through some of the rules that we enacted. Then the second process is the legislative process. We have a state legislature. It's elected, and that legislature can pass laws regulating the gas industry. And in fact, the legislature in Pennsylvania did do that. They passed Act 13, what we call Act 13. And this law addresses things like setbacks, zoning of local governments, and other issues. So those are the two processes we use for addressing those 9 issues that I talked about before associated with shale gas development. the executive branch process and the legislative branch process. Since we're in the US, we also have a federal government. So it's not just what the state governments do, it's also what the federal government does. And there's a whole long list of federal laws that actually apply to gas regulation in the US and in Pennsylvania. When you listen to Gasland, you'll probably leave the movie thinking that the federal government has no role in regulating shale gas or anything to do with shale gas development. That's actually not true. It's one of the many parts of Gasland that is highly misleading. The federal government issues all kinds of permits that the gas industry must, in fact, get in order to move gas from a gas well to market. Air permits, water permits, all kinds of permits that they must get, or the gas isn't moving to sale. So what did we do in Pennsylvania with those 9 issues? We enacted these 4 regulatory packages, and then one other that I'll mention. We put in place a rule to protect rivers and streams from having too much water taken out of them in order to frack a well. That's the first one, water withdrawal plan. In Pennsylvania, you must, if you are drilling a well, at the time that you apply for a drilling permit, state where you're going to get the water from that would be used to frack the well. And there's a very protective standard used to judge whether that water plan will be approved. To put it simply, if the water withdrawal would in fact damage a stream when it's in drought, then the water withdrawal would not be approved. So it's very protective of the resource. And as David also pointed out, Pennsylvania has a lot of water. So shame on us if we're allowing gas drilling and fracking to cause damage to our rivers and streams. And since we've put in place this plan requirement, to my knowledge at least, we've had no problems, 0 problems, because of withdrawing water from rivers or streams to frack a well. I will tell you, actually, before the plan went into place, we did have 2 such problems, where drillers had taken too much water out of a very small stream and caused some damage to the stream. So the need for this rule is real, but with it in place, we have not had problems. The second issue has to do with what must be done to dispose of the drilling wastewater when it comes back up the well. This is a very important rule. And I will tell you, in Pennsylvania, prior to the shale gas development, our rule was you can actually take that drilling wastewater with very little treatment and discharge it to a river or stream and allow the flow in the river and stream to dilute the TDS, or the total dissolved solids, and quote unquote make it safe. That was our rule for decades and decades and decades. Not a very good rule. When shale gas development started, I realized that if we continued to do that, it would cause massive damage to our rivers and streams. So we changed our rules because of shale gas development. One could say we should have changed those rules long ago, but the fact of the matter is shale gas development and the attention on how this industry operates because of it led to changing this rule on what you can do with drilling wastewater when it comes back up. Now the rules are quite protective, and in response to that protective rule, the gas industry innovated. They developed recycling and reuse, which we've talked about. 90% of the shale gas water now is recycling and reused. Number 3 is new strong drilling standards. This is to address the issue of how you cement a well, how you design a well, the casing. It is in part intended to deal with the issue of gas migration, which we talked about. Rules on the page are important, but operational excellence is also important. I mean, frankly, you can have very strong rules, and if the operators are making mistakes, perhaps an honest mistake, nonetheless, that will create a problem. So you have to have good rules, good enforcement to build that culture of safety, and then you need excellence in operations. We also put in place mandatory buffer requirements for all of our best streams, which is 22,000 miles of our best streams. And this is a protection from all development, not just shale gas development, but building homes, building roads, shops, all kinds of things. There's more detail here on the water withdrawal rule that you can see in the presentation, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on through that. Here's just some listing of the items in the drilling standards rule. As you can see, it includes all kinds of categories of issues that ought to happen. Again, this is in the presentation, and I know the materials will be provided to you. This is the buffer rule that I mentioned. Now, staffing. Let's stop on this one for a moment. When I became secretary of the department in Pennsylvania, the staff that was dedicated to overseeing the gas industry, in other words, they worked full-time on overseeing the gas industry, totaled 88 positions. We more than doubled that to 202. We went and hired a considerable amount of capacity to make sure that the shale gas development had real oversight. And that was paid for by raising a fee charged to the industry itself. And to the industry's credit, they actually supported that fee increase. And it was a very significant fee increase. It raised about $10 million to $13 million a year. And all of that additional revenue was put into paying the existing staff plus hiring a lot more staff. And I think this is an issue that has to be addressed when you're standing up shale gas development. You need to also make sure that the regulatory oversight is good. It's not enough to have good rules on paper and the staff hired that's trained to do the job. They also have to be told to go and enforce the rules responsibly. And in Pennsylvania, we told our inspectors, when you see a problem, write a notice of violation. And 1,200 notices of violation were issued to the industry in 2010. To the industry's credit, they appealed virtually none of them. There's an appeal process in Pennsylvania. When you get a notice of violation, you can actually appeal them. To industry credit, they would sometimes grumble because they didn't quite agree. I get that. But at the end of the day, they would actually pretty much fix the issue and go on with their business. So I think that's a good lesson and a good example. This is a little picture showing the water withdrawal issue. As David pointed out, it's a very small part of the water withdrawn in our state. Very little of the water withdrawn is withdrawn for fracking, less than 1%. We withdraw 9.48 billion gallons per day for all uses. That's everything. That's our power plants, factories, everything. And shale development is a very, very, very small piece of that total. This has already been discussed today, the methods of disposing of drilling wastewater. So again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk more about it. If there's questions, we can deal with that during the question period. These are, for me, the 4 key issues left for us to really focus on in Pennsylvania. And it will be different, perhaps, in Colombia or other parts of the world. But these are the 4 issues that we think we have more work to do in Pennsylvania, at least what I think we have more work to do. One is the air emissions issue. It matters whether a compressor engine is running on electricity, whether a compressor engine, if it's running on diesel, has the best pollution controls on that engine available or not. These things matter to the air quality in Pennsylvania. And that's a human health issue. That's a real human health issue. Methane leakage. This is the concern about perhaps venting large amounts of methane, which is a very significant global warming agent, to the atmosphere. In Pennsylvania and the US, a lot of progress has been made on methane leakage. In fact, our national agency, the EPA, has passed a rule requiring what's called reduced emission completions or green completions for nearly all gas wells. All wells that aren't really exploratory gas wells must have reduced emission completions by 2015, further proving that the federal government in the USA does, in fact, regulate shale gas development to some degree or another. Gas migration, that's an issue that we've talked about, and we can talk more about that in questions. Induced seismicity, those are also issues. I would say induced seismicity is an issue more outside of Pennsylvania, simply because we don't have actually very many underground injection wells. As David said, we have 5. But that earthquake in Youngstown shook buildings in Youngstown, but it also shook public confidence in Pennsylvania, I can assure you, even though we didn't feel by any means that event. So this is an issue that the industry and regulators need to address. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to actually spend a lot on this. This goes to the issue of methane leakage and the discussion of, from a climate perspective, does using more natural gas reduce overall carbon emissions and global warming pollution or not? There's one study that says it does not. It's by Professor Howarth from Cornell. There are now actually, this is a little out of date, there are now 8 studies that says it does. I'm a very sharp critic of Professor Howarth's study, and I can go into detail about that if you would like. But I think it's really beyond argument that using natural gas is cleaner in terms of global warming pollution, as well as things like mercury, arsenic, lead, soot, things that actually cause immediate public health threats and illness. I realize that this is now, unfortunately, a matter of discussion because the Howarth study got so much publicity. It's sort of like Gasland. You know, Gasland has gotten a lot of publicity. And I think, frankly, it's unfortunate because in this case, this study is a fringe minority study that is really done by somebody who wants to keep gas drilling out of his local community. And people have every right to oppose gas drilling in the US, and I assume in most parts of the world if they want to do that. I think when they get to the point of doing science, then there's a higher obligation towards the truth. These are some of the studies that conflict with Professor Howarth. There's another study, the MIT study that just came out, looking closely at methane emissions during the flowback period, and it's really devastating to the Howarth study, the MIT study that's just come out. By the way, I write a blog, and I do it pretty much every day, and that's the address down there, johnhanger.blogspot. Oh, it says sport. It's wrong. Blogspot.com. And I have written about the MIT study just recently, if you're interested. These are some of the major cases involving shale gas contamination or asserted shale gas contamination in the US that have gotten a lot of attention. Dimock is in my state, Pennsylvania. We looked at 60 gas wells, 60 water wells in Pennsylvania at Dimock, and we found that 18 had in fact been contaminated by mistakes in gas drilling. We did very detailed isotopic analysis of the gas in those 18 wells, and it was thermogenic. There were clear problems with some gas wells near those water wells, and the case for finding that the 18 water wells had been contaminated by mistakes in gas drilling was in fact overwhelming. Now, what was also proven in Dimock is that frac fluids did not return from depth and contaminate anybody's aquifer. That did not happen in Dimock. Sometimes those who want to shut down the gas industry leave the impression that chemicals in Dimock were found. That's not true. Frankly, sometimes those in the industry leave the impression that nothing ever happened in Dimock that was a mistake. That also is not true. There was a mistake in gas drilling. It led to methane migrating to 18 water wells.